Hello and bonjour. You are watching Power Dilemma with Sarah Bukhari at TAG TV. A judge on Monday ruled against Premier Ford's plan to cut council nearly in half to 25 wards from a planned 47. Ford plans to invoke notwithstanding clause for the first time in province's history and will call back legislature on Bill 5. Premier Doug Ford has triggered the nuclear option in his battle to slash Toronto City Council, writes the Toronto Star. Ford took the unprecedented step of invoking the notwithstanding clause of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to override a court's ruling that was unconstitutional for him to cut the number of councillors from 47 to 25 in the middle of the municipal election, the Star writes. But with the urgency of a looming October 22nd city election, Ford is also recalling the legislature today, September the 12th, to invoke Section 33 of the Constitution and ensure passage of the Better Local Government Act, a democratically elected government trying to be shut down by the courts that concerns me more than anything, Premier Ford said, adding the courts have made him feel like I'm sitting here handcuffed with a piece of tape over my mouth, watching what I say. Is Premier Ford's decision to invoke the notwithstanding clause of the Charter of Rights and Freedom to override the court's ruling fair, or is it legal? The answer is yes, as Steve Paikin of TVO writes. He can do this, and the original framers of the clause, also known as Section 33, actually anticipated these circumstances, which is why it's there to begin with, Steve Paikin further writes. To understand why the notwithstanding clause exists, you've got to go back 37 years to the most consequential First Minister's meeting since Confederation. The current Prime Minister's father, Pierre Trudeau, had decided after returning to power in 1980 that constitutional renewal would be the watchword of what turned out to be his final term. Trudeau thought it was unacceptable that a mature, independent country such as Canada still required the United Kingdom's parliamentary permission to amend its own constitution. So in November 1981, he gathered all the premiers in Ottawa to try to hammer out an agreement. The idea was to develop a made-in-Canada amending formula for the Constitution with an accompanying Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So in today's Power Dilemma, we are going to unearth what is going on with invoking of this notwithstanding act. And to talk about this, we have our regular commentator, Mr. Jamie Allerton of Conaptus. Welcome to my show, and it's good to have you here in my show after the summer break.
Thanks for having me back, Sarah.
Okay, so Jamie, let's hear from you. Is it legal what Premier Ford is doing?
Well, it is most definitely legal. The ruling that came down from the Superior Court earlier this week took more issues with the timing and process of Bill 5 that passed to ultimately change the setup and makeup of a Toronto City Council, and in its ruling actually welcomed the government to reintroduce legislation at a later date to try and do this again. So it's well documented that in the Canadian Constitution, then the jurisprudence since, that the municipalities are a creation of the province, and provinces have responsibility for that jurisdiction. And in doing such, the government is going to reintroduce legislation today to help push this back through. I think where a lot of the concern and a lot of the blowback we've seen is, yes, those that are opposed to the idea of shrinking council will continue to scream from the rooftops, and I think we've seen what that hysterical response has been, but that the option of going to the notwithstanding clause before appealing this to the Court of Appeal, and then if need be, ultimately to the Supreme Court, that Premier Ford is needlessly trampling on people's rights and doesn't respect due process. So that's where we are this afternoon. the Premier has called back the legislature for a sitting a couple weeks early from when it was supposed to resume after, of course, its rare summer session in order to reintroduce legislation formerly known as Bill 5. I expect it to have a new bill number because it is a new piece of legislation that will include the notwithstanding clause of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and this will ultimately be debated and, in theory, with the support of the PC Majority Caucus, pass sometime next week.
Okay, so can you just allude more on Bill 5, which he's introducing today?
So Bill 5 was the bill that was passed this summer, and what that essentially did was reduce the number of Toronto City Councillors from 47 down to 25.
Right.
And it also canceled the elections, which were going to be held for the first time for the regional chair in places like Peel and Durham, or York Region. So instead of having an election for those will continue to be appointed by their respective councils that make up those respective regions. And this will also go back to re-legislate the process that would see 25 ward boundaries in this upcoming Toronto municipal election. Okay,
so let's talk about why is Premier Ford shrinking the City Council?
So if you take Premier Ford at face value, he says that the City Hall is unruly and dysfunctional, and that we are going to have one councillor for one MPP for one MP at Toronto City Hall. So he thinks a smaller council will lead to a more streamlined decision-making and ultimately help Toronto get things done more efficiently.
Okay, so let's go back to Premier Ford invoking the notwithstanding clause. By doing so, Jamie, do you think he is setting aside the Charter of Rights and Freedoms?
Well, the notwithstanding clause is actually in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I think a lot of legal experts have actually questioned the soundness of the Superior Court decision that came down Monday morning. So it is within the rights of the provincial legislature, or the federal government for that matter, to pass legislation that invokes the notwithstanding clause, which makes sure that Parliament, or in this case the legislature, is supreme in terms of how we govern ourselves as a democracy. But I think a lot of the blowback on this is kind of, if you look at what Premier Ford's tone has been and how he's gone about this, a lot of people, and I would put myself in this camp, a lot of people who support the the end goal of ultimately reducing the size of City Council and helping to make the city run more efficiently, the process and the way he's gone about this has kind of been haphazard, and this rush process is ultimately what led to the Superior Court decision. We look at what's currently going on in the city of Toronto as it relates to the municipal election. This is an election that's already underway, and for the province to take this unprecedented step and to kind of intervene in the midst of that selection, a lot of people take issue with. And I think thirdly, I think there's real political consequences here. Canadians, by and large, support the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's something they're proud about. And when they hear that the Premier is invoking the notwithstanding clause, that gets a lot of people's back up against the wall. And some defending its use might say it's relatively innocuous, given that the issue and that our fundamental freedoms are by no means under threat here. The fact that the Premier has already done this and is willing to spend so much political capital this early in his mandate to get something that's frankly relatively small in the grander scheme of things. Like, we still have a $12 billion deficit in Ontario. We still have hours-long wait anytime you go to an emergency room and hallway health care. We saw a report just 2 weeks ago or last week that math scores continue to fall across the province. There are a lot of big issues that Premier Ford and his government are going to need to work on to turn this province around after 15 years of Liberal rule, and to go so full pressure, full court press ahead on the Toronto City Council is burning a lot of political capital, and I think burning up a lot of goodwill that he's going to need for fights ahead.
So why do you think Premier Ford is taking up this issue over other issues like hallway health care, the province is in debt, and he's burning a lot of, as you said, a lot of political capital?
That's ultimately a question for a Premier. I think all we can do is judge him by his own actions and his words. He continues to talk about the need to streamline City Council. He talks about how the only people opposed to this are apparently left-wing NDP types. That's more or less what he constantly says. And so a lot of this, frankly, comes across as like a personal grudge and vendetta against his former political opponents at Toronto City Hall. Whether or not that's actually the reason, you'll have to ask the Premier, and whether or not he would admit to such a thing, well, time will only tell. But when you see him like he was in the legislature this morning, naming perceived left-wing councillors one by one and talking about what he's going to do, and kind of really going after the NDP, to me, it's very unbecoming of a premier, and it's rather unfortunate.
So do you think we are into a political battle in Toronto versus City Hall, Toronto versus Queen's Park?
There has always been a somewhat acrimonious relationship between whoever the mayor and councillors are of the day and the premier of the day at Queen's Park. That's the nature of how our system, quite frankly, functions. The same can be applied to the federal government and the provinces. Sometimes they get along really well, and other times, even within the same governments, they do not. If you look at some of the things that have been going on, a lot of the politicians, regardless of political stripe, are actually talking about the same kind of issues in the city of Toronto, be that taxation and bringing pocketbook relief to families, the need to get transit built and tackle gridlock, or address the housing affordability. That doesn't necessarily mean low-income housing when people think of housing affordability that way, but also for the growing demographic of millennials who find themselves priced out of this housing market due to the real constraints on supply coming on stream into the market forces. So there's politics kind of forces you to work with others who you may not always work with. And so after, I think, this fall, if this legislation indeed does pass, as is being reintroduced today, obviously Toronto will still have its election under probably what will now be the 25 ward boundaries for this upcoming municipal election. That new council is going to work for City Hall, because at the end of the day, the same voters that vote municipally, provincially, federally, those are all Torontonians, and they're going to expect that their levels of government somehow get along to get things done.
So do you think in the backdrop of this political battle, the October 22nd election will be held on the very date, or it might change?
I think that's kind of somewhat up in the air. Of course, the new council doesn't officially start. I believe it's December 1st is the official date, if not late November. So if the government, one of the things they could do as a result of the kind of timing of this and the Superior Court decision that struck down the law and is forcing this special session of the legislature to push through new legislation, one of the things they could do is actually extend voting date as a part of that. The same for nomination windows for people to be able to register as candidates. They could, if they so chose to, in this legislation being introduced today, extend those dates so that a more fair process could be run.
Was it the opportune time for the Premier to start taking this action at this time, very early in his premiership and very near to the municipal election?
That's ultimately a question for the Premier. He clearly is putting a lot of political capital into this and feels really strongly about it, and has been able to maintain the support of his caucus and his cabinet in driving this forward. I think a lot of people would question why the urgency to get this done, but for whatever reason that only the Premier truly knows, he has opted to do this, and he's going to push these changes forward.
If you were in Premier Ford's cabinet, what would you advise him on these actions, Jamie?
So on Monday, actually, after this announcement came down, I put forth on Twitter and in some of the other media commentary I've done that this was not a hill worth dying on. Within the Superior Court judge's decision, he very much welcomed the government to come back and reintroduce legislation that wasn't going to impact essentially this current election period, was the broader takeaway of it. It's within the constitutional jurisdiction of the province to pass this legislation, and so rather than turning this into a fight and just needlessly burning so much political capital and goodwill amongst people in the province of Ontario, he could have held off on this, come back with new legislation later this fall, have it pass either this fall session or in the session in the new year, and have new rules for an election 4 years down the road. Obviously, the Premier has not taken that advice, and he's willing to spend the political capital and do what he needs to do to get this passed so that this year's municipal election fall under new rules.
Do you think his own followers and voters might turn against him on this very step?
I think if you look at kind of the reaction we've seen in the public over the past few days now, you've seen kind of people resort back to their kind of tribes, where the NDP are kind of like a fever pitch opposition, and a lot of Conservatives are, of course, just touting what the government has said, and of course the Liberals don't have official party status, and they've been relatively hard to hear from, given how few of them there are in Ontario politics these days. But I think the biggest risk for something like this is that it actually puts off mainstream and middle-of-the-road voters who probably don't follow politics and the minutiae of it on a day-to-day basis. But when they hear stuff like this and the kind of fever-pitch language, and you hear like invoking the notwithstanding clause to override charter rights, it really kind of makes it harder for the governments to win over their support, and it makes it harder for them to have to not only get their support in future elections, but ultimately maintain the goodwill to continue to act on their mandate for change.
Okay, maybe it's shaping the future image of Premier Ford. What do you say?
Oh, most definitely, and I think he's very much, frankly, proud of that fact. He continues to say that this is something he wants to do, and that he was elected with a large mandate to do just that, and he's going to fight back. For others, of course, who are opposed to that, they'll continue to speak out. But if there's one thing that's become crystal clear in the past 48 hours and changed since the Superior Court judgment came down, is that Premier Ford is happy to put this albatross around his neck and let the voters judge him for what he's done in 4 years' time.
There were a lot of allegations on the worthy judge. What do you have to say?
What do you mean?
There were a lot of allegations on the judge that he's the same judge who has taken a lot of very not fair decisions in the past. The judge who took this very decision of rejecting Ford's claim of shrinking the council.
Yeah, what I would say as an overarching comment is that I think Canadians pride ourselves on having an independent judiciary that is free from political interference, and lawyers and legal minds can definitely debate the merits of any particular ruling and decision. And at the end of the day, this was a Superior Court ruling. This could have been appealed to the Court of Appeal, and if the decision was also lost there, ultimately did the Supreme Court to weigh in on this. I think if we in Canada enter an era where we're going to start to undermine our independent judiciary system and try and inject partisan politics into that, that's a very dangerous road to go down on, and Canada was better off to not do that.
Okay, no, it is a dangerous, looks like a dangerous road. Jamie, it was very good to talk to you, and once we come back, we are going to talk to Jamie a little bit more. Welcome back to Power Dilemma. We are talking to Mr. Jamie Allerton about the constitutionality of invoking the notwithstanding clause by Premier Ford. Jamie, I have a question. Judge Belobeba said that Bill 5 infringed upon charter rights and is deemed unconstitutional. Can you allude on this, please?
So, in summary, what the justice took issue with in his ruling was that by intervening and changing the rules in the middle of this election, it essentially intervened on the Section 2 and Section 3 combination of the charter based on the proneness and fairness of what is at hand. So a lot of legal scholars have taken issue and don't think that this decision would stand up in a court of appeal. But the Premier Ford and his government have decided that in the interest of time, and given how close we are getting to voting day in Toronto at the end of October, that they were not going to wait. While they are definitely appealing this decision to the Court of Appeal, they're not going to wait for that legal court process to play itself out, and are instead going to recall the legislature, as they have done today, and reintroduce what is now Bill 31, an efficient local government act, to essentially reintroduce all the same clauses and legislation that was included in Bill 5 that implemented these changes, but to also include the notwithstanding clause to say just that notwithstanding essentially, I don't know how it's going to be worded in the legislation itself, but notwithstanding the issues cited in the Superior Court ruling's judgment, the Parliament, the Ontario Legislature has the final say, and are using aspects, Section 31 of the Section 33 of the Constitution to pass this new law.
Okay, I know, Jamie, you are short on time. We just have 1 minute. I just wanted to ask you a question connected to politics and, you know, our judiciary. do you think this is a battle between parliamentarians and judiciary, or the legislative section of the government and the judicial part?
I don't think this is a battle in that kind of regard. There are always people
or a conflict
on the spectrum who complain about judicial activism, and I think you can definitely have a debate. And in a democracy, you could have a debate over whether or not the judges and the judicial system should be reading things into laws that the text of the laws themselves do not say. And I think that's a very welcomed and healthy debate. Ultimately, Parliament is supreme, and that's why the notwithstanding clause was included in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Constitution when it was repatriated, to give legislatures and the House of Commons, or Parliament, including the Senate, in Ottawa, the final say on these matters.
Mm-hmm. Very quickly, can a premier call a judge that he is wrong?
The premier can definitely say he's going to disagree with the judge, but that's ultimately not going to interfere with judicial independence. Mm-hmm. If you think a judge is wrong with their ruling, the way to respond to that is to appeal that to the next level of court, and if need be, continue to appeal it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. But one of the fundamental tenets of Canadian democracy is the rule of law. Now, whether you're a Premier Ford or a janitor at McDonald's, mm-hmm. We are all benefit of the rule of law and subject to the same rules. And that's one of the things that, frankly, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Constitution, going back to the British North America Act, hold up. Kind of going back to the original Magna Carta, where the king couldn't do as he pleases, and that it had to be one rule for all. One rule for all.
Thank you so much, Jamie. It was so good to talk to you. That was Jamie.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was Mr. Jamie Alerton of Conaptus. Viewers, today at Power Dilemma, we dealt with the legalities of Premier Ford invoking the notwithstanding clause connected to the shrinking of the Toronto City Council from 47 to 27. The main idea of governments in North America, in democracy, is to uphold the rule of law, and law should be abided by at any circumstances. Let's see how far this battle will go on. With this thought, we're going to come next week. Stay tuned. Ciao.